Imagine waking up one morning and deciding to buy flowers. That's it. That's the plot. Or at least that's how it appears on the surface. But by the time you finish Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, you will have traveled through decades of memory, survived the trauma of war, questioned the meaning of sanity, and confronted death itself, all before a dinner party. Mrs. Dalloway is not a novel you read. It's a novel that happens to you. Hello everyone, welcome to Hardika Reads, and today we are going to talk about Virginia Woolf's famous novel, Mrs. Dalloway. Before we get into this novel, we need to talk about the woman who wrote it, because to understand Mrs. Dalloway, you have to understand Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf was born in 1882 in London into a highly intellectual family. Her father was Sir Leslie Stephen, a prominent literary critic and historian. From the very beginning, she was surrounded by books, ideas, and brilliant minds. But her life was also marked by profound tragedy. Her mother died when Virginia was just 13. Her half-sister died 2 years later. Her father died in 1904. And through all of this, Virginia suffered serious mental breakdowns, what we would today recognize as bipolar disorder and severe depression. She heard voices. She was institutionalized multiple times. And yet, she wrote some of the most beautiful, luminous prose in the English language. She became part of the Bloomsbury Group, a circle of writers, artists, and intellectuals in London that included E.M. Forster, John Maynard Keynes, Lytton Strachey. These were people who challenged every Victorian convention, social, artistic, and sexual. She was a feminist ahead of her time. Her essay, A Room of One's Own, is still one of the most powerful arguments for women's creative freedom ever written. In 1941, at the age of 59, Virginia Woolf filled her coat pockets with stones and walked into the River Ouse near her home. She drowned herself. In a note to her husband Leonard, she wrote that she was hearing voices again and she didn't think she could fight it one more time. The woman who wrote Mrs. Dalloway, a novel in which a character contemplates death as a form of liberation, died by the very act her characters circle around. That context matters deeply. Mrs. Dalloway was published in 1925 and it is set in a single day in June 1923, just 5 years after the end of World War I. Now we need to pause and really feel what that means. World War I was not just a war. It was a civilizational catastrophe. By the time it ended in 1918, approximately 17 million people were dead. Entire generations of young men had been sent into trenches, literal ditches in the ground, and slaughtered by machine guns, poison gas, and artillery shells. The technology of killing had finally outpaced any human romance notion of heroism or glory. The soldiers who came back were not the same men who left. Many had what was then called shell shock. Today we call it PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. They couldn't sleep. They hallucinated. They heard explosions that weren't there. They saw dead friends in the faces of strangers. The government and the medical establishment largely dismissed them. Society told them the war is over, move on, get back to normal. But what was normal anymore? The old world, the Victorian and Edwardian world of certainty, empire, social order, and Christian faith had been obliterated in the trenches. If God existed, where was he at the Somme? If civilization was progressing, how did it produce mustard gas? This is the world of Mrs. Dalloway. London in 1923 is beautiful, buzzing, full of summer sunshine and garden parties. but underneath it is a city haunted. You can see it in the way Woolf writes about the war. It keeps appearing uninvited in the middle of ordinary moments. A woman thinks of that nice boy who was killed. Someone sees a memorial. The word, the war drops into sentences like a stone into water, and ripples spread. The party Clarissa Dalloway is preparing for, the elegant, glittering social gathering, is happening in a society that is still bleeding. It just doesn't talk about it at dinner. Now, to understand why Woolf writes the way she does, we need to understand the literary movement she was part of. Modernism. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a complete explosion in how artists understood human experience. Sigmund Freud had just revealed that the unconscious, those hidden desires, fears, and memories buried beneath our everyday thoughts, was the engine driving human behavior. Albert Einstein had just upended our understanding of time and space. Charles Darwin had already shattered the idea that humans were created in God's image. If the self was unconscious, if time was relative, if God was dead, then what was literature for? Victorian novels had been built on certain assumptions: that characters could be understood through their actions and speech, that stories had clear beginnings, middles, and ends, that a third-person narrator could tell us objectively what was happening. The modernists said, that's not how consciousness actually works. Modernist literature broke from tradition in several key ways. First, it rejected linear storytelling. Real thought doesn't move in a straight line. One moment you are buying flowers, the next you are remembering your first love 20 years ago, the next you are back in the present watching a car drive past. Modernist novels follow this associative, looping, fragmented movement. Second, it turned inward. Instead of describing the external world, modernist writers tried to capture the interior world. What it actually feels like to be a human being, thinking, remembering, fearing, desiring. Third, it questioned truth and reality. There's no single objective version of events. What Clarissa sees and what Peter sees and what Septimus sees are all equally real and completely different. Fourth, it experimented with form. Poetry started looking weird on the page. Think of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Novels lost their omniscient narrators. Time bent and stretched. Key figures of modernism were, of course, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, William Faulkner, Franz Kafka. These weren't just writers. They were people trying to rebuild the idea of what literature could do after the old world had been destroyed. The technique Mrs. Dalloway is most famous for is called stream of consciousness, and it is Woolf's greatest gift to literature. The term was actually coined by the philosopher and psychologist William James, brother of novelist Henry James, in 1890. He described human thought not as a chain of distinct, separate ideas, but as a stream, continuous, flowing, always moving, one thing blending into another. Virginia Woolf took this idea and made it a literary technique. Here is what stream of consciousness does. Instead of the author telling you about a character, you are placed inside their mind. You hear their thoughts as they occur, half-formed, digressive, leaping between past and present, between the significant and the trivial, exactly as real thought does. In a traditional Victorian novel, a narrator might write, Clarissa remembered her past with fondness as she walked through the streets of London. In Woolf's stream of consciousness, the same experience becomes, quoting from the novel, what a lark, what a plunge! For so it had always seemed to her when, with a little squeak of the hinges, she had burst open the French windows and plunged at Burton into the open air. Notice, she doesn't tell you Clarissa is remembering, she drops you inside the memory. The exclamation, the sensory detail, the squeak of the hinges. The immediate shift between the present, that is London 1923, and the past, Burton 30 years ago. You experience time the way consciousness actually experiences it. Not as a timeline, but as a layering, a constant bleeding of them into now. Woolf is often compared to James Joyce, who was using similar techniques in Ulysses, published in 1922, just 3 years before Mrs. Dalloway. Both novels take place in a single day, both use stream of consciousness. But Woolf's prose is different in texture, where Joyce is dense, elusive, sometimes deliberately difficult. Woolf is lyrical, rhythmic, almost musical. She described her own method as writing to the rhythm of the waves. There's one more literary concept you need to understand before we get into the story, and that concept is epiphany. The term was popularized in a literary sense by James Joyce, who defined it as a moment of sudden, overwhelming insight, when something ordinary suddenly reveals its hidden, profound meaning. The Greek word epiphania literally means appearance or manifestation. Think of those moments in life when something suddenly clicks, when you are watching the light on the water or you hear a piece of music, and for a brief second, everything feels unbearably meaningful. That's an epiphany. Mrs. Dalloway is built from these moments. Clarissa walking down Bond Street and suddenly being flooded with intensity of just being alive. Septimus watching the trees and hearing them speak. Peter Walsh sitting in Regent's Park and feeling grief rise in him like a physical wave. These are not plot moments. They are moments of consciousness touching itself. Woolf believed that truth wasn't found in grand narratives or dramatic events. It was found in these flashes, these moments when, as she wrote in a diary, the moment was all. Alright, let's talk about what actually happens in the book. The entire novel takes place in one day, a Wednesday in June 1923 in London. We follow two main characters whose paths will eventually briefly intersect. First is Clarissa Dalloway. Clarissa Dalloway is a 52-year-old upper-class woman. She is married to Richard Dalloway, a member of Parliament. She lives in Westminster in an elegant house. On this particular morning, she is preparing for a party she is giving that evening. She goes out to buy flowers herself. She walks through London. She greets old friends. She sews her dress. She thinks endlessly, beautifully about her past, her choices, her loves, her life. She had a choice, long ago. Marry the passionate, difficult Peter Walsh, who loved her fiercely and challenged everything about her. Or marry the steady, respectable, admirable Richard Dalloway, who gave her space and security. She chose Richard. Peter is back in London from India after years away and will appear on her doorstep that very morning. She had another great love, Sally Seton, wild, brilliant, unconventional Sally, whom she once kissed in the garden at Burton and felt she thought the most exquisite moment of her life. Another character is Septimus Warren Smith. He's a young man, a World War I veteran, suffering from what we would recognize as severe PTSD. He is married to a gentle Italian woman named Lucrezia or Razia, who is at her wit's end. Septimus hallucinates. He sees his dead comrade Evans everywhere. He hears trees speaking. He feels he has a mission to communicate profound truths to the world. His doctors, Dr. Holmes and the powerful Sir William Bradshaw, see him as a case to be managed, contained, institutionalized. Clarissa and Septimus never meet. They don't know about each other's existence. And yet, by the end of the novel, they are mirrored so completely that Clarissa's soul will be transformed by the news of his death. The novel asks, what does it mean to be alive? What is the cost of survival? Who gets to decide what is sane? And is the glittering surface of social life a cage or an act of love? That's it for today. In part 2, we are going to go deep into the text itself, the actual language of the novel. We look at Woolf's most extraordinary passage, break down what she's doing sentence by sentence, and understand how she builds her two parallel worlds, Clarissa's world of parties and memory, and Septimus's world of war and vision. If this video helped you, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in part 2.